The Chindits, officially designated as Long-Range Penetration Groups, LRPG, represented one of the most innovative, controversial, and strategically unique special forces formations employed by the Allies during the tumultuous period of World War II. These highly specialized units were conceptualized, championed, and primarily commanded by the brilliant, deeply eccentric, and intensely motivated Major General Ord Wingate. Their defining characteristic was the execution of highly unorthodox, deep jungle operations conducted entirely behind enemy lines within Japanese-occupied Burma. The fundamental purpose of these missions was not the conventional military objective of seizing and holding ground, but rather the focused objective of wreaking strategic havoc, systematically disrupting Japanese military supply lines, destroying vital communications infrastructure, and, perhaps most crucially, psychologically demonstrating that the prevailing detrimental belief in the Japanese military's invincibility within the deep jungle environment, a belief solidified after the catastrophic British defeat in 1942, was fundamentally false and vulnerable to persistent, unconventional harassment. The formation and deployment of the Chindits served as an aggressive, necessary, and direct strategic response to the pervasive morale crisis within the entire Allied command structure in the Far East. The evocative name Chindit itself is a local corruption of the Burmese word chinthe, which refers to the mythical half-lion, half-griffin creature often depicted guarding the entrances of Buddhist temples, a highly appropriate and powerful symbol for a military force specifically designed to strike suddenly, silently, and lethally from the deep, hidden sanctuary of the jungle wilderness. The Chindits were not a single, monolithic regiment, but rather a composite, rapidly assembled brigade, which later expanded into a full division, comprising a highly motivated mix of seasoned, often overlooked troops drawn from the British and Indian armies, including units like the Tough Kings Regiment, the agile Gurkha Rifles, the local Burma Rifles, and various supporting elements. Their operational training regime was notoriously, purposefully brutal, rigorously designed to systematically strip away the troops' psychological and practical reliance on traditional linear logistics and static supply lines. Troops were subjected to intense preparation to ensure they could operate entirely self-sufficiently for periods stretching into months, surviving solely off infrequent, precisely coordinated air-dropped supplies and whatever meager, often inadequate resources they could forage or capture from the unforgiving, disease-ridden environment of the Burmese jungle. Wingate's groundbreaking military innovation, the Chindit Doctrine, centered on the concept of human mules, units trained and equipped to penetrate vast distances into hostile enemy territory, utilizing mules and porters to physically haul crucial heavy equipment, specialized radios, and all the required ammunition, and establishing temporary, highly mobile, and rapidly defensible bases known strategically as strongholds. Their paramount mission objective was strategic disruption and interdiction, not engaging in direct, prolonged combat with large-scale Japanese formations. The Chindits aimed specifically to cripple the Japanese operational railway line, the vital Mandalay-Myitkyina Railway, blow up strategic roads and bridges, destroy critical supply dumps, and, most importantly, force the Japanese command to divert significant, combat-ready forces resources that were critically needed on the main front, away from the decisive battles to chase ephemeral, mobile phantom threats deep in their rear. The first attempt to prove the viability of this radical doctrine was the first Chindit expedition, Operation Longcloth, which was launched in February 1943. A force of approximately 3,000 Chindits successfully crossed the Chindwin River and penetrated an astonishing distance of over 200 miles into the heart of Japanese-held Burma. The operation initially secured significant, headline-making early successes, including the systematic tearing up of multiple sections of the essential railway line and catching several Japanese garrisons entirely by surprise. However, The immense, terrifying true cost of Wingate's unconventional concept became brutally apparent during this initial mission. The highly motivated Japanese forces reacted with overwhelming ferocity, relentlessly hunting the scattered Chindit columns. Exhausted, severely malnourished, and suffering rampantly from debilitating tropical diseases such as malaria and dysentery, the force was ultimately ordered to break into small groups and exfiltrate in April 1943. The harrowing journey back from Operation Longcloth was a catastrophic, absolute test of the limits of human will and physical endurance. Of the original 3,000 men who entered the deep jungles of Burma, nearly one-third, almost 1,000 men, were either killed in action, captured, or tragically died from disease and exhaustion during the brutal, prolonged retreat. Those who miraculously returned to Allied lines were often severely emaciated, physically broken, and required extensive, long-term hospital treatment to recover from the ravages of the jungle and malnutrition. The actual, quantifiable military effectiveness of the operation remained a subject of fierce and divisive debate among high command staff. While the railway disruption was undeniably temporary, the psychological impact on both Allied and enemy forces was immediate and profound. It definitively proved, for the first time, that highly trained British Indian troops could survive, outmaneuver, and successfully outfight the Japanese in their own perceived jungle element, effectively shattering the pervasive, demoralizing myth of Japanese invincibility and providing an immense, much-needed morale boost across the entire Allied front. Despite the high, controversial human cost and the intense military debate that followed the first expedition, the concept's potential deeply impressed key Allied global leaders, most notably British Prime Minister Winston Churchill and US General George C. Marshall. Their support was crucial, and they authorized a massive, unprecedented expansion of the LRPG into a full division for the far more ambitious and strategically complex Second Chindit Expedition, Operation Thursday, which was launched in February 1944. This second operation was designed to be exponentially larger and more strategically deep-reaching than its predecessor, crucially relying on a key, revolutionary new technological advantage to solve the logistical bottleneck: air power. This operation was intended to coincide with and support the major Allied push to retake northern Burma. Operation Thursday commenced with an audacious, highly innovative military move that completely bypassed the crippling initial jungle march. The Chindits, totaling over 20,000 highly trained personnel, were rapidly flown deep into the heart of Japanese-held territory in a carefully coordinated series of glider landings onto small, hastily prepared jungle clearings. These clearings were immediately and heavily fortified into secure temporary landing strips known by code names such as Broadway and Piccadilly. This unprecedented use of air transport entirely eliminated the need for the debilitating 200-mile march across the Chindwin River and through the initial jungle, effectively preserving the troops' strength and achieving complete strategic surprise deep behind the established Japanese front lines. The innovative, large-scale use of specialized American-made Waco and British Hotspur gliders for the rapid, quiet insertion of troops and heavy equipment was recognized as a major, high-risk military innovation that fundamentally altered the tactical potential of deep penetration. Once the strongholds were successfully established and secured, the Chindits immediately began their relentless, systematic campaign of disruption, operating in autonomous columns that often numbered over 500 men, each acting as a self-contained mobile military unit. Their operational priority remained the crippling of the Japanese supply system. They focused intensely on interdicting and systematically cutting the main north-south railway lines and ruthlessly disrupting all road and river traffic carrying supplies to the front. These mobile columns rapidly evolved into self-sufficient miniature communities, operating far beyond the effective reach of conventional Allied ground forces and relying absolutely on the precision, regularity, and security of frequent airdropped supplies, known universally as drops. The failure to secure a scheduled airdrop, or the successful compromise of a drop zone by the enemy, meant immediate, critical starvation for the entire column, placing immense pressure on the logistics of the aerial delivery team. The constant, relentless psychological pressure exerted on the Chindit soldiers was perhaps even more immense than the physical strain. They were forced to operate for months on end in total isolation, knowing at all times that they were potentially hundreds of miles from the nearest Allied unit and entirely surrounded by a highly motivated, aggressive, and determined enemy force. Every snapped twig, every jungle cry, every unfamiliar sound was perceived as a potential threat, requiring immediate action. The jungle itself was an unyielding, cruel foe. Debilitating humidity, torrential sudden rains, millions of blood-sucking leeches, and virulent tropical diseases like severe malaria and deadly scrub typhus inflicted a constant stream of casualties and relentlessly sapped the fighting strength of every single man. They were essentially fighting a continuous war of extreme, often terminal, physical and mental endurance against the enemy and the environment simultaneously. A Chindit stronghold, exemplified by the famous Blackpool base, was not a permanent structure, but a temporary fortress, meticulously constructed and camouflaged deep in the jungle, often capable of accommodating thousands of men and serving multiple functions. A forward battlefield airfield, landing strips were known as strips, a small hospital, and a massive supply dump. When the Japanese successfully located and mounted a serious coordinated attack on one of these bases, the Chindits were rigorously trained to fight vicious, tenacious defensive battles until a strategic decision was made to evacuate and disappear back into the jungle. The demonstrated ability of the Chindits to quickly create, operate from, and then suddenly abandon these operational bases deep within enemy territory was a constant source of profound military frustration, paranoia, and fear for the entire Japanese command structure. The successful Chindit operations during Operation Thursday made a direct, substantial, and vital contribution to the eventual Allied victory in the crucial Battle of Kohima and Imphal. By systematically cutting the main Japanese logistical railway and relentlessly disrupting communication lines, they severely impaired the ability of the Japanese 15th Army to receive essential supplies, food, and troop reinforcements during their massive, aggressive assault on India. The Japanese High Command was ultimately forced to divert entire regiments of combat troops away from the critical front lines to hunt down, contain, and eliminate the highly elusive Chindit columns in their rear, effectively bleeding the IJAS already severely limited manpower and fragile logistical resources in the depths of Burma. The complex, often strained relationship between Ord Wingate and the men under his command was a key defining feature of the LRPG. Wingate, a deeply intense, controversial, and fiercely religious figure, was capable of inspiring both fierce, unwavering loyalty and a deep-seated, almost messianic belief in his unconventional radical methods. However, his uncompromising, often impossible demands for absolute physical and mental toughness also attracted significant criticism regarding the consistently high attrition rate and the perceived lack of adequate, proper medical evacuation resources, which many critics felt bordered on active neglect to controversy that remains central to the legacy of the entire Chindit enterprise. The tragic and decisive death of General Wingate in a plane crash in March 1944, occurring very early in the pivotal Operation Thursday, was an immense and fracturing blow to the entire command structure. Following his sudden death, the operation's centralized strategic focus rapidly blurred, and subsequent, less authoritative commanders were often compelled to yield to the insistent operational demands of the powerful American General Joseph Stilwell. Stilwell, a traditionalist, saw the Chindits not as independent strategic disruptors, but merely as highly mobile, highly trained conventional infantry to be used in his own operations to capture Japanese bases and clear territory along the China supply route, diluting their original unconventional purpose. The inherent nature of the Chindit missions inevitably led to frequent, brutal, and intimate close-quarters combat. When the autonomous columns encountered small or large Japanese units, the resulting fighting was often savage, characterized by silent, sudden ambushes, fierce grenade battles in the undergrowth, and desperate bayonet charges. Crucially, there was generally no surrender sought, accepted, or given on either side, reflecting the deep psychological hatred and brutality of the Burma front. These small, vicious encounters only further compounded the immense physical and psychological exhaustion of the men, who were invariably forced to carry on moving immediately after a fight, leaving their dead comrades behind, lest the noise attract larger enemy formations. Medical conditions within the deep jungle columns were persistently and brutally desperate. Without the support of conventional hospitals or established medical lines, men who fell critically ill or were severely wounded were often given rudimentary, difficult treatment within the secured strongholds or required perilous evacuation by light aircraft, a high-risk undertaking, often conducted under enemy fire. The grim reality for many seriously ill or immobilized wounded Chindits was that they had to be left behind, or were given lethal doses of morphine by their comrades to avoid the absolute certainty of capture and subsequent torture at the hands of the Japanese, a tragic, chilling decision that underlined the unforgiving no retreat, no surrender doctrine of the LRPG units. One of the most persistent and draining practical difficulties faced by the Chindits was the complex, non-negotiable issue of mule management. These sturdy animals were responsible for carrying absolutely vital wireless equipment, heavy support weapons like mortars, and all the required ammunition for the column's survival. They were often considered as critically important as the men themselves, yet they were notoriously difficult to control, particularly during moments of sudden enemy contact or during the high-stress execution of airdrops. The constant maintenance, feeding, and care of these essential animals in the debilitating tropical climate and hostile jungle environment became a continuous, draining, secondary task for the already weary and stressed soldiers. The measurable psychological impact that the Chindits inflicted upon the Japanese military command was a significant, though intangible, victory in its own right. The persistent, unpredictable presence of highly mobile, well-armed enemy columns deep within their rear operational area created widespread paranoia, extreme suspicion, and administrative chaos. Japanese field commanders never knew where the Chindits would strike next, or where they would suddenly disappear, forcing them to vastly over-garrison their railway lines and constantly divert critical combat resources to the non-productive task of securing their long, vulnerable supply routes, a relentless, cumulative pressure that stretched the IJA's notoriously fragile logistical system to its absolute, irreversible breaking point. The entire concept of long-range penetration, as conceived and executed by Wingate, was a true and undeniable military innovation that demonstrably laid the foundational groundwork for the evolution of modern special operations forces globally. The Chindits' highly innovative methods of air-supplied deep penetration, the establishment of rapidly mobile, easily defensible strongholds, and the strategic doctrine of operating in small, autonomous, and self-sufficient columns provided an effective, working blueprint that was later adopted, refined, and heavily embedded in the training and doctrine of many subsequent specialized units worldwide, demonstrating a successful and lasting paradigm shift away from traditional linear warfare. Furthermore, the Chindits pioneered and refined highly sophisticated radio communication methods that were absolutely vital for coordinating the complex, precise airdrops and for directing the autonomous tactical movements of columns hundreds of miles apart. Maintaining reliable wireless contact with HQ, often over vast distances of dense mountains and jungle, was a non-negotiable task and a direct key to survival. The heavy, specialized wireless sets were typically carried by the mules and required constant, meticulous maintenance from dedicated, highly skilled signalers, whose specialized communication skills were consistently proven to be non-negotiable to the operational effectiveness and ultimate survival of the entire column. The eventual end of Operation Thursday was notoriously messy, controversial, and unsatisfying from a strategic standpoint. Following Wingate's death, the Chindits were systematically overused and improperly deployed by General Stilwell, essentially being ground down in conventional, static battles around the crucial Japanese base at Maidkaina, a role for which they were neither trained nor equipped. By August 1944, the battered, decimated units were finally withdrawn, having undeniably achieved their core disruptive goals, but at the staggering cost of crippling, preventable casualties and near-total physical and mental exhaustion. They were subsequently never fully reconstituted as a single, independent Special Forces formation. The final tragic tally of the second expedition was devastatingly high. Over 4,000 Chindits were either killed in action, severely wounded, or succumbed to terminal disease, with the vast majority being evacuated due to complete physical breakdown. The cumulative physical and psychological toll on the few survivors was immense, leading to disproportionately high rates of post-war breakdown, severe medical issues, and long-term mental health challenges. This tragic, grim legacy stands as a painful, enduring echo of the invisible, psychological wounds sustained during the ultimate, sustained test of endurance in the deep, unforgiving jungle. The enduring, long-term legacy of the Chindits is complex, one of unconventional, crucial strategic success bought at an undeniable, terrible human price. While the localized and operational disruption they caused was unquestionably vital to the overall strategic Allied victory in Burma, the human cost, measured in lives lost and physical health destroyed, was staggering. The entire campaign remains a constant subject of intense military and ethical debate. Did the significant, undeniable strategic gains and military innovations ultimately justify the immense, long-term physical and mental sacrifice demanded of the men who volunteered for and endured the ultimate, sustained test of jungle warfare? The powerful legacy of the Chindits is proudly preserved today within the traditions, honors, and mottos of various contemporary British and Indian Army regiments. While the original LRPG structure was officially disbanded after the war, the crucial, hard-won lessons learned, particularly the highly innovative lessons concerning jungle survival techniques, the tactical execution of continuous air-supported operations, and the strategic power of small unit autonomy, were deeply embedded in the contemporary training and doctrine of subsequent Special Forces units globally, including the modern British Special Air Service, SAS, and various specialized elements of the Indian Army's Special Forces establishment. Ultimately, the Chindits' unique story is one of supreme, almost unimaginable endurance, resilience, and revolutionary military thought. Operating in an environment where securing every sip of water, every necessary meal, and traversing every single mile was a constant, draining battle in itself, the Chindits truly embodied the definition of a forgotten army special unit. They decisively proved that the morale, ingenuity, and fighting spirit of British and Indian troops could successfully overcome the greatest tactical and physical challenges posed both by the formidable Imperial Japanese Army and the relentlessly unforgiving tropical landscape. The Chindits' success was not purely tactical, but fundamentally strategic. They conclusively proved that deep penetration behind enemy lines was a militarily viable option, shattering the enemy's critical sense of security and forcing the Japanese to lose their essential military initiative and momentum. Their brutal, relentless missions served as the essential grinding mechanism of disruption that helped to enable the subsequent, larger, and more conventional victories that eventually followed in the Burmese theater, irrevocably securing their rightful place as a critical, tragic, and highly instructive chapter in the history of Allied special operations.